So I'm going to be given the gift this morning of the principal's voice because our microphone system isn't working. So I'm hoping that I can talk to the very last person in the back row. I'd like to talk to you this morning, and by the way, it's my honor to be able to preach to you today. It's a delightful thing to be with you, but to preach to you is just another cream on the cake, icing on the cake. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about obedience. And I'll start with a story in my own life that took place about 50 years ago. I was a young altar boy at Our Lady of Fatima Catholic Church, and the Mass was still in Latin. I loved Palm Sunday, because at least we got something. And of course, being 10 years old with my other cohorts, we had sword fights with the palm fronds in the sacristy. Now, there were two sacristies. There was the priest's sacristy, and then there's where we got dressed. So we were messing around, and sure enough, Father Benninghausen came back and stood at the doorway into the boys' sacristy and gave us the glare. Y'all know the glare? You've all experienced the glare. So we straightened up, kind of figured things was going to, we had to look pious again, which lasted about 30 seconds. Then, during the wonderful service, it went on forever. And it was in Latin. And altar boys had to kneel on this very thin padding on top of this very hard terrazzo floor. It was most difficult to keep some sort of comportment that would look something like we had been trained to look. Particularly when my best friend John decided that it was time to tickle my ear with the palm frond. This resulted in another glare from Sister Domitilla. Thank you. Now, a glare from Sister Domitilla was more serious than Father Benninghausen because Sister Domitilla was our teacher. And if we messed up enough on Sunday, we paid for it on Monday. She had the glare that could stop clocks. Most of us, when we think about obedience, we may think about those times when we were littler children, kids, and there was an inequality in our status. So we got used to the idea of obeying because there was an authority figure who had more status than we did. They were adults, or priests, or nuns, or parents. Yeah, even parents. But we got used to that as a model of obedience, and we have to understand there's a different kind of obedience that happens amongst adults. When Jesus is being obedient, it isn't this type of obedience. It's an obedience of listening amongst, in a sense, equals. The closest we get to this as human beings, I think, is when a couple dances with each other, ballroom dancing. They learn that with every step forward and with every counterpoint, that they are in balance and out of balance and in balance, that somebody is leading while the other person is following. But the leader becomes the follower in the counterbalance. The goal, the decision of these two people is to listen to one another, to get an idea of what they are trying to accomplish, which in this case is dancing with a certain amount of grace and harmony. This is an example of obedience. The listening to someone else, the willingness to allow someone else to have sway over literally in dancing, but in obedience, to listen to someone else. There is not a sense of domination or submission. It is amongst equals. Jesus, we hear in Philippians, emptied himself in obedience to the point of death. He created room in his life for the presence of someone else who was God. Listening is a sign of obedience. Listening is a sign of hospitality. It is the welcoming of someone into our lives. And when we listen to someone, we hear their dreams and their hopes, their desires, their loves. We open ourselves to them, to listen to them. Not what we are going to respond to them with, but to them, to hear them deeply. We are in obedience as we listen to someone. This is the type of obedience that Jesus had. Now, when I was 10, what I wanted Jesus to do, or at least Sister Domitilla, and I believe she was old enough to have been at the original Passion. I wanted Jesus at some point along the way to give the glare. Why not just look at Pilate and make him feel the fool that he really was? Why not give him the glare? Why does it seem that Jesus is so passive? The judge says to him, "Are you the Son of God?" That's what you say. Come on, give me a bolt of lightning. The truth, I think, really is that Jesus is not being passive. He is not being submissive. He is being genuine to who he was as a person all of his life. He set out and preached and lived the willingness and the desire to be open to the will of God, to listen to the will of God. This is a man who lived his life that way. And he was caught up now in a courtroom that knew no justice, yet Jesus had preached about justice. It was a courtroom and a crowd of people, no longer neighbors, no longer able to hear one another, so full of themselves, so full of their own self-importance, so full of their own need, frankly, to be entertained, they could not listen. The Word of God was not deaf. The Word of God only could be present to those who would not listen. What was he to say to these people? They didn't want to hear what he had to say. His obedience to God, his hospitality to God, was opening his heart. And in his last hours, all that was left to him was being, as he so often did, an example. A quiet one, but very powerful. That there is a different way. That in the midst of this crowd, in the midst of this injustice, in the midst of this riot, it was possible for God to be present, even in those moments when you and I may have felt like our lives were being swept away by things much larger than us. That there was a way for God to be present even in that. Jesus was not passive. He was listening for God's will. He was listening for justice and mercy and peace and love as he had his whole life. Our story ends oddly, I think. We hear about someone who had no real skin in the game, no need to listen. The Roman soldiers certainly knew obedience, but it was that kind. Captain says do this, soldier does that. But a good soldier knows to kind of monitor and see what's going on with people. And the soldier could understand, his curiosity at least, opened him enough to figure out something big was going on. The Roman soldier just doing his duty. His heart was more open than the chief priests or Pilate or Herod or the crowd that cried out to free Barabbas. The Roman soldier, listening, said these words, "Truly, this is the Son of God." Our job Holy Week is to listen. In the chaos and the noise and the static of our lives, to set aside some time to listen to God, to welcome God, to see our neighbor, not to be a crowd, but to see our brothers and sisters. Holy Week is a time for us to enter into these great mysteries, some of which are best observed listening. Truly, this is the Son of God. God be with you.